I am Dr. Jose Alvino Ventura, and welcome to my channel, Medical Perspective on Defensive Tactics. In today's video, I will talk about the history of law enforcement and private security in the United States. So let's get to it. We can't discuss the history of defensive tactics without first briefly touching on the history of private security and law enforcement in order to put things into context, which is the purpose of today's video. Please keep in mind that since I am from the United States, the information is focused on this country. The notion of having a force that upholds common societal standards as well as provide internal protection is older than the concept of an institutionalized police force and was present around the world. Private security and public law enforcement have co-evolved since ancient times. Some of the earliest examples in Western history of security and policing include prehistoric shepherds who were used to protect flocks as well as warn of raids by other tribes. Private guards used by Egyptian pharaohs as far back as 2700 BCE to protect life and property. Ancient Greeks and Romans who had a body of men who would enforce laws as well as deal with fires. Then during the medieval times, there were groups of men tasked with upholding laws and capturing fugitives as well as imprisoning criminals. The history of policing in the United States begins with the 13 original colonies. The following is a timeline of the evolution of police and private security since the founding of the original 13 colonies in 1607. In 1635, the city of Boston, Massachusetts, establishes a system of night watch, which was made up of part-time volunteer officers. On September 24, 1789, the United States Congress creates the first federal law enforcement agency, which was the United States Marshals. The first 13 marshals were appointed by then-President George Washington, who happens to be the first president of the United States. In 1835, the state of Texas created the Texas Rangers, making it the oldest state law enforcement agency in the United States. The prototype for modern law enforcement, ironically, began in 1850 with the founding of a private entity named Pinkerton's National Detective Agency by Scottish immigrant Alan Pinkerton in Chicago, Illinois. The aspiration of Mr. Pinkerton was to set the standard of policing and free it from the political influences and corruption which plagued police agencies at the time. Pinkerton's agency began operating by providing private detectives and guards to the railroad. From its railroad roots, the Pinkerton agency evolved over time and even provided security to the then-President Abraham Lincoln and thwarted an assassination attempt in 1861. In the aftermath of the assassination attempt, Alan Pinkerton served as chief of the Union Intelligence Service in 1861 and 1862. 1857 was a pivotal year for law enforcement because Baltimore, Maryland, became the first police department to issue firearms to their officers. In 1858, Boston and Chicago became the first police departments to issue uniforms to their officers. 1865 was the year the United States Secret Service was established. In the 1900s, police became highly politicized and plagued with corruption. During the 1920s and 1930s, saw the rise of professional organized criminal organizations known as mafias. During this era, it was apparent that the criminals were better financed via things such as bootlegging, armed and organized law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at the time, became pivotal in this era and introduced many of the law enforcement hiring, training methods, techniques, and tactics recognized to this day. During the 1920s and 1930s, the police were removed from political control and turned into nonpartisan public entities. World War II introduced military discipline, methods, tactics, and training procedures. The 1960s and 1970s era of civil rights movements was the time when police actions became televised when handling situations. The Newhall incident of April 6, 1970, led to changes and major reforms in the way of training procedures, firearms use, and arrest techniques. The first SWAT, which stands for Special Weapons and Tactics Team, was conceptualized in the 1960s and established by the Los Angeles Police Department in 1971 in order to deal with armed radical political groups who resorted to urban guerrilla tactics, violent criminals, hostage situations, and kidnappings, as well as rioting, among other extremely dangerous scenarios. On May 17, 1974, the SLA gunfight, which occurred between law enforcement and a heavily armed urban guerrilla group band known as the Symbionese Liberation Army in Los Angeles, California, demonstrated the capabilities and advantages of a SWAT team, cementing their stay as well as creation of similar teams across the United States. On April 11, 1986, the infamous Miami shootout took place, where 2 FBI agents were killed and 5 were wounded and led to the adoption of semi-automatic handguns and replaced the standard issue revolvers, as well as the adoption of shotguns and rifles by federal agencies. On April 28, 1997, another infamous shootout occurred, but this time in North Hollywood, California, when two heavily armed bank robbers wearing body armor confronted the police. The result of the confrontation was 12 injured officers and 8 injured civilians, with the two culprits dead. Upon analyzing the shootout, it was determined that arming rank-and-file police officers with semi-automatic assault rifles was necessary and not just reserved for SWAT and other specialized teams. Furthermore, small unit tactic training was also implemented to deal with future similar incidents. The Columbine High School shooting, which happened on April 20th, 1999, was another pivotal moment in law enforcement. This mass shooting sadly began a trend which would continue to the present day. As a result of the mass shooting, the presence of law enforcement in schools has increased, and so has the use of private security, both armed and unarmed. There is also frequent training by both law enforcement and private security in active shooter scenarios. The September 11th attacks of 2001 happened just 2 years after Columbine and thrusted law enforcement into its current era. In essence, the shift towards counterterrorism of the many agencies and its ramifications in crime fighting and intelligence gathering, plus the further militarization of equipment and tactics after the terrorist attacks, shaped the police force into what is seen today. Right after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, the Department of Homeland Security was founded on November 25th, 2002, as a national unifying effort to safeguard the United States from terrorism. Since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, some private security companies have been awarded federal contracts and formed partnerships with law enforcement agencies. During the present law enforcement private security, also known as LE-PS partnerships, have become more common at the local, state, and federal levels in the United States. Private security guards outnumber police officers at a ratio of 3 to 1, and that difference has been growing since the latter part of the 20th century. Partnerships between law enforcement and private security have been formed and expanded in order to address several needs, such as averting and responding to terrorist attacks, allocate resources to combat financial crimes, mitigate the effects of law enforcement budget cuts, improve the safety and security of special events, and secure critical national infrastructure. The takeaway from today's video should be that law enforcement and private security are as ancient as human society. Law enforcement and private security have co-evolved, and the outdated mall cop stereotype when it comes to private security must be dispelled, because in our current times, private security now performs many of the functions and receives similar training which in the past were exclusively done by law enforcement. Law enforcement and private security work together. In a sense, things have come back full circle. A clear example of how highly trained private security can be seen in the armed private security force which guards the privately owned nuclear power plants and infrastructure in the United States, which are touted as being as amongst the best protected facilities in the country. And that's a wrap for today's video. I hope this presentation was both educational and enjoyable. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Until next time.